I am currently 25 years old, but the chilling events I am about to relate took place in the bitter chill of early 2024. At the time, I was 23, residing in a spacious, older, and somewhat isolated house located deep within the heavily forested suburbs of Portland, Oregon. My mother was a deeply committed and perpetually exhausted emergency room trauma nurse. Due to the chronic understaffing at her hospital, she frequently volunteered to work the brutal graveyard shifts on the weekends. Because my father had passed away many years prior, I naturally assumed the role of the secondary caretaker for my 12-year-old sister, Clara, and my 8-year-old brother, Julian. I embraced this responsibility with a fierce dedication, always prioritizing their safety above all else. On this particular Saturday evening in late January, the legendary Oregon winter was displaying its full fury. The relentless freezing rain poured from the darkened sky in massive, heavy sheets. The water washed over our sloping roof and completely obscured the world beyond our double-pane windows. The wind howled relentlessly, causing the ancient pine trees surrounding our property to sway dangerously close to the power lines. Our home had a very specific, slightly convoluted architectural layout that played a highly significant role in how the nightmare of that night unfolded. When you entered the house through the heavy, solid oak front door, you immediately found yourself standing in a wide, high-ceilinged foyer. A long, narrow hallway extended directly ahead from this entry point, leading past a small downstairs guest bathroom and terminating at my mother's cluttered home office. To the right side of the main foyer was our large, open-concept kitchen and a formal dining area that we rarely used. To the left side, a steep, creaky, thickly carpeted staircase led upward to the second floor. At the top of these stairs, a narrow corridor connected 4 distinct rooms. Straight ahead was the main family bathroom, complete with a vintage clawfoot bathtub. The first door on the right side of the hallway opened into my personal bedroom. The second door on the right belonged to my younger brother, Julian. Directly across the hall from my bedroom was the spacious master suite where my mother slept, and Clara occupied the brightly painted room immediately adjacent to the master suite. Before my mother departed for her grueling 12-hour shift at the busy city hospital, she handed me $40 in cash so that I could order dinner for the 3 of us. She reminded me emphatically to secure the deadbolt on the front door, kissed each of us affectionately on the forehead, and rushed out into the driving rain. After she left, I immediately engaged the heavy brass locks on every exterior door. I used my cellular phone to call a popular local Italian restaurant and ordered a massive pepperoni pizza, a large garden salad, and a double order of garlic bread. We spent the first few uninterrupted hours of the evening eating our delicious dinner in the cozy living room while watching a long, sweeping fantasy adventure film on the television. The interior of the house felt immensely warm, inviting, and secure against the freezing, wet, chaotic night raging just outside our walls. The heating system hummed consistently, providing a comforting background ambience. After we finally finished our meal and cleared away the empty cardboard boxes, Clara stood up and announced that she was going to use the downstairs guest bathroom. Julian was completely absorbed in constructing a massive tower out of colorful plastic building blocks on the plush area rug, and I was casually scrolling through various news articles and social media updates on my cellular phone. A few tense minutes later, Clara returned to the living room. Her entire demeanor had shifted drastically. Her face was completely drained of all color, rendering her skin a sickly pale white. Her eyes were wide with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She walked over to where I was sitting, moving slowly and stiffly. She leaned in close and whispered, her voice trembling violently, that she had just seen a man staring directly at her through the frosted glass of the small bathroom window. Initially, I tried my hardest to rationalize her intense fear. I gently told her that it was highly likely just a visual trick played by the passing headlights of a car, or perhaps the distorted shadow of the large oak tree branches swaying violently in the stormy wind. I desperately did not want to alarm young Julian, who was still happily playing on the floor, so I kept my voice incredibly calm and soothing. However, despite my outward projection of confidence, a deep, icy, and entirely unsettling feeling began to take firm root in the pit of my stomach. Just to be absolutely certain of our safety, I instructed my siblings to stay very close to me in the living room and explicitly told them not to wander off into any other part of the house. Approximately 45 agonizing minutes passed without any further incidents or strange occurrences. The freezing rain continued to fall heavily against the roof, providing a steady rhythm to the tense atmosphere. Then, entirely without warning, the brass handle of the heavy front door began to jiggle violently. Someone on the outside was aggressively trying to force their way into our home. I immediately raised my hand and signaled for my brother and sister to remain completely and utterly silent. I crept slowly toward the foyer, walking solely on the balls of my feet to avoid making the floorboards creak. My heart was hammering against my ribs so forcefully that I feared it might burst. I leaned forward and pressed my right eye firmly against the small circular glass peephole embedded in the thick wood of the front door. The flickering yellow glow of the porch light illuminated a truly horrifying sight. A tall, heavily built man stood aggressively on our welcome mat. His dark, tattered clothing was completely soaked through and plastered tightly against his skin. His long, unkempt, greasy brown hair hung in messy, wet strands across his pale, sunken face. He looked neglected, desperate, and entirely wild. But the absolute most terrifying detail of all was the large, serrated military-style hunting knife that he held tightly gripped in his right hand. The blade gleamed menacingly under the dim porch light. Pure panic surged rapidly through my veins, but my deeply ingrained protective instincts immediately took full control of my actions. I spun around swiftly and rushed back to the living room as silently as possible. I quickly told Julian to turn off the television and extinguish all the lamps in the room. The entire lower level of the house was instantly plunged into near total darkness. I instructed Clara to grab my cellular phone from the wooden coffee table. I ran swiftly into the kitchen, my bare feet sliding slightly on the linoleum floor, and retrieved the longest, sharpest, heaviest steel chef knife we owned from the wooden butcher block on the counter. I hurried back to the dark foyer, gripping the kitchen knife tightly, and told my brother and sister to move upstairs as quickly and quietly as humanly possible. I formulated a desperate survival plan in a matter of fleeting seconds. Once we reached the second floor, I guided little Julian into his bedroom and pushed him gently but firmly underneath his bed. I pulled the heavy, oversized comforter down to the floor to conceal his small body entirely. I then led a crying Clara into our mother's master bedroom and hid her deep within the spacious walk-in closet. I buried her completely behind several rows of heavy winter coats and hanging dresses. I took my cellular phone back from her trembling hands and sternly told her not to make a single noise, no matter what happened next. I walked quickly across the narrow hall and stepped into the upstairs family bathroom. I climbed clumsily into the large porcelain bathtub and pulled the thick, opaque, floral-patterned shower curtain completely closed around me. I sat down heavily in the cold darkness of the tub, gripping the heavy kitchen knife tightly in my right hand and my cellular phone in my left. Downstairs, the terrible situation escalated rapidly. The heavy oak front door suddenly gave way under immense force. The deadbolt lock completely failed, the wood splintering violently, and the heavy door swung inward with tremendous momentum. I could distinctly feel the deep vibrations of heavy, wet boots walking heavily across the hardwood floor of the main foyer. I opened my cellular phone, my fingers shaking uncontrollably, and dialed the emergency services number, pressing the device incredibly tightly against my ear. The emergency operator answered quickly, and I whispered my home address and the terrifying situation with absolute desperate urgency. I begged them to dispatch officers immediately. The heavy, deliberate footsteps began to ascend the carpeted stairs. Each individual step felt like an agonizing eternity. I held my breath entirely, covering my mouth tightly with my free hand to mask the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing. The intruder finally reached the second-floor landing. He paused there. I could clearly hear his heavy, wet, labored breathing echoing from the hallway. Then, the bathroom door was slowly, deliberately pushed open. The ambient light from the street lamp outside cast a faint, eerie, silver glow into the room through the window, but I remained entirely concealed behind the thick plastic curtain. The man stepped fully inside the small bathroom. He paced around the confined space slowly. I squeezed my eyes shut, fully expecting the shower curtain to be violently ripped aside at any given moment. Every muscle in my body was coiled entirely tight, ready to strike if necessary. But miraculously, after what felt like a lifetime of agonizing tension, he turned around and walked back out into the upstairs hallway. I waited in the cold tub for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few agonizing minutes. The terrifying thought of this armed, unpredictable man finding Clara or Julian filled me with a sudden, blind, overwhelming rage. I knew deep down that I could not simply hide in the bathtub while they remained in mortal danger. I slowly and carefully stood up in the porcelain bathtub, taking extreme care not to rustle the plastic curtain or lose my footing. I stepped quietly out onto the soft bath mat, holding the large chef knife defensively in front of me. I crept stealthily toward the open bathroom door and peered cautiously out into the dark hallway. The intruder was standing near my brother's bedroom door, his back entirely turned toward my position. A massive wave of adrenaline completely flooded my entire system. I sprinted out of the bathroom and charged directly at the intruder with every ounce of strength I possessed. I drove my right shoulder forcefully into the center of his back, knocking him completely off balance. As he stumbled awkwardly forward, I swung the heavy kitchen knife and struck him deeply in the upper shoulder area. He cried out in absolute, piercing agony and immediately dropped his serrated hunting weapon onto the carpet. He scrambled desperately to his feet, clutching his profusely bleeding shoulder, and ran frantically toward the top of the stairs. He stumbled wildly down the wooden steps in a panicked, uncoordinated frenzy. As he reached the bottom floor and bolted toward the splintered open front door, flashing red and blue lights brightly illuminated the foyer. Several heavily armed police officers had just arrived and were rushing up the front walkway with their weapons drawn. They apprehended the injured man immediately, forcing him aggressively to the wet ground and securing his wrists tightly in metal restraints. I dropped my kitchen knife onto the carpet and leaned heavily against the hallway wall, completely and utterly exhausted. I called out softly to Clara and Julian, telling them repeatedly that the danger had passed and it was finally safe to come out of their hiding places. We gathered together in the hallway, holding each other tightly and sobbing uncontrollably. The police officers entered the home, checked on our well-being, and immediately contacted my mother. She rushed home from the hospital in a state of absolute, frantic terror, arriving with tears streaming down her face. She was so deeply traumatized by the horrifying event that she resigned from her night shift position the very next week, opting strictly for daytime hours despite the lower pay. We moved out of that isolated suburban house a few short months later, relocating to a busy, well-lit apartment complex in the center of the city. That stormy night remains the absolute most horrifying experience of my entire life, serving as a constant, chilling reminder of how quickly and unexpectedly security can be shattered. I never look at an unlit window the same way again, and I always obsessively check every single lock twice before finally attempting to go to sleep. I expanded my awareness of home security dramatically, insisting on installing heavy-duty deadbolts and high-tech motion sensor lights at our new residence. The memory of that greasy, desperate man and his gleaming hunting blade still haunts my worst nightmares. However, whenever the terror threatens to overwhelm me, I find deep, lasting comfort in the undeniable fact that I acted bravely and protected my young brother and sister when they needed me the absolute most. I am presently a 22-year-old college student, but I was around 15 years old at the time this particular, deeply unsettling event unfolded. It was late January of 2025, and I was living in a quiet residential neighborhood situated on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado. There was a thick, pristine layer of fresh snow blanketing the ground, and the temperatures had dropped well below freezing. I found myself completely home alone on a Saturday afternoon while my entire family, including my parents and two older brothers, had driven across town to do some extensive grocery shopping at the local supermarket. I had deliberately chosen not to accompany them because I was suffering from a rather severe, exhausting fever. However, truth be told, even if I had been in perfect health, I likely would have opted to stay behind in the comfort of my own home anyway. For as long as I can remember, I have struggled with a fairly intense degree of social anxiety. I have never felt comfortable navigating through large, bustling crowds of strangers, constantly burdened by the irrational but entirely paralyzing fear that I am being closely scrutinized and judged by everyone around me. Consequently, my bedroom was my ultimate sanctuary. To set the scene properly, it had been approximately 30 minutes since my family's large vehicle pulled out of the snowy driveway. I was reclining comfortably on my plush mattress, bundled under several thick, woolen blankets to combat my chills. Lying directly beside me, functioning as a warm, heavy, and immensely comforting presence, was my fiercely protective German Shepherd mix, a beautiful dog named Shadow. It is absolutely imperative that you keep Shadow in mind, because his presence and subsequent actions form the absolute core of this entire ordeal. I was deeply engrossed in watching an elaborate historical drama series on my portable laptop computer. The volume was relatively low, creating a quiet, peaceful atmosphere within the bedroom. Suddenly, out of the extreme corner of my left eye, I noticed a distinct, sudden movement outside. I saw what unmistakably appeared to be a large, human-shaped silhouette pass very quickly across the exterior of my ground-floor bedroom window. My initial reaction was to immediately try and brush the sighting off. I desperately attempted to rationalize the incident in my feverish mind, convincing myself that it was merely a large bird flying low, or perhaps a neighbor briefly walking past the property line. But despite my frantic mental gymnastics, a profound, undeniable gut feeling began to gnaw at me, insisting that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Choosing to temporarily disregard this intense feeling of dread, I forcefully directed my visual attention back to the glowing screen of my laptop. Approximately 10 minutes passed. The quiet ambience of the room was suddenly shattered when Shadow abruptly leaped off the edge of my bed. He stood rigidly on the carpeted floor, his hackles raised completely straight, and began to emit a low, continuous, menacing vibration from deep within his chest while staring intently at my window. At first, I did not attribute too much significance to his aggressive behavior. Knowing his habits well, I was fully aware that he frequently acted this way whenever wild deer or stray neighborhood cats wandered too closely to our property line. However, the vivid memory of the fleeting shadow I had witnessed earlier rushed back into the forefront of my mind. Almost instantaneously, I felt the sickening sensation of my stomach dropping entirely numb. I slowly pushed the heavy blankets aside, my legs trembling slightly from both the residual fever and the sudden spike of pure fear. I walked extremely slowly and cautiously toward the window to see if anything or anyone was actually out there. At first, cursory glance, the snowy landscape appeared completely barren and undisturbed. I let out a very small, shaky sigh of relief. Then, my heart plummeted entirely into my shoes. I adjusted my line of sight and looked directly across the flat expanse of the snow-covered yard. There, pressed deeply into the fresh white powder, was a distinct, undeniable set of heavy boot prints. The most terrifying aspect was the direction they traveled. The deep impressions led systematically from the edge of the street, straight across the lawn, and ended abruptly directly beneath my bedroom window. I was completely, utterly terrified at this point. I was absolutely paralyzed by the overwhelming fear of looking down at the space immediately adjacent to the exterior wall of my house. But despite the screaming protests of my own mind, I slowly, reluctantly let my eyes venture downward into the depths of my own personal nightmare. Crouched right below the glass of the window pane, pressed tightly and awkwardly against the freezing siding of the house, I saw a full-grown man. He appeared to be very tall, perhaps over 6 feet in height based on the length of his folded limbs. He had unkempt, dirty blonde hair that fell into his eyes, a thick, patchy beard, and piercing, manic blue eyes. He was heavily dressed in a dark gray, insulated winter snowsuit. As I looked down, he suddenly tilted his head upward and looked directly back at me. Both of us were instantly frozen in place, locked together in a silent, terrifying moment of mutual realization. We maintained direct, unbroken eye contact for what could only have been about 10 or 15 seconds. But in my panic-stricken state, That incredibly brief span of time felt like an absolute, unending eternity. The moment the paralyzing shock finally broke, my survival instincts kicked into high gear. I lunged across the room, grabbed my cellular phone from the nightstand, and ran as fast as my weakened legs could possibly carry me. I sprinted out of my bedroom, rushed up the central staircase to the second floor of the house, and locked myself securely inside the main upstairs bathroom. Downstairs, I could clearly hear Shadow escalating his defensive display, his deep, aggressive vocalizations echoing loudly throughout the otherwise empty house. But in my state of absolute panic, I could not focus on the dog. I made the hasty, fear-driven decision to dial my mother's cellular number. In hindsight, I fully recognized how irrational and foolish this action was. I absolutely should have contacted the local police authorities immediately. However, I was operating purely on primal emotion, and in that terrifying moment, the only thing that promised any semblance of safety or comfort was the familiar, soothing sound of my mother's voice. The very moment she answered the call, she instantly recognized the severe distress in my tone. She could hear the uncontrollable shaking in my voice and the raw panic in my rapid breathing. I quickly and frantically explained the horrifying situation occurring at the house. She immediately instructed me to stay hidden, assured me that my father was already contacting the local police department on his phone, and promised that they were speeding back to the house as fast as the snowy roads would safely allow. For a very brief, fleeting moment, the intense situation seemed to be stabilizing. Although I was still shivering violently and deeply traumatized by the visual of the man at the window, knowing that help was actively on the way provided a small measure of comfort. I sat on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, clutching the phone tightly to my chest. But then, that fragile illusion of safety came completely crashing down around me. From the lower level of the house, I suddenly heard the distinct, sharp, horrifying noise of thick glass completely shattering inward. The intruder had broken the window and was entering my home. I sincerely thought I was going to lose consciousness entirely. The room began to spin, and I was trembling so violently that I could barely maintain my grip on the phone. I could not formulate a single coherent thought. The very next sound that echoed up the staircase was a series of agonizing, blood-curdling screams. They were the loud, desperate, terrified vocalizations of a grown man in immense physical pain. In that exact moment, the chaotic situation suddenly made sense. Shadow, my incredibly loyal and fiercely protective companion, was actively attacking the intruder the moment he stepped through the broken window. I remained seated on the bathroom floor, still completely terrified, but a strange, unexpected wave of immense relief and profound gratitude washed over me. I listened closely as the violent struggle downstairs continued briefly before the intruder's screams shifted from pain to absolute panic. Shortly after, I heard the heavy, commanding voices of police officers entering the front of the house, followed closely by the frantic calls of my parents. My mother rushed up the stairs and called my name through the bathroom door. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and fell directly into her arms. I can state with absolute honesty that I had never experienced a more profound sense of safety and unconditional love than I did in that specific moment. She carefully guided me down the stairs. As we passed the front entryway, I witnessed several police officers forcefully escorting the intruder out the front door in heavy metal handcuffs. He was openly weeping, his heavy winter suit completely torn, and his arms visibly bleeding from numerous defensive wounds inflicted by my dog. Suddenly, Shadow came rushing through the hallway, his tail wagging happily. He barreled directly into my legs, aggressively licking my hands and face, completely uninjured and radiating a proud energy. I could tell immediately by the look in his eyes that he fully understood he had successfully defended our home. I still have Shadow to this very day. He's now 9 years old, and despite his advancing age and slightly graying muzzle, he still possesses the playful, energetic spirit of a young puppy. I will forever hold an incredibly deep, unwavering love for that remarkable animal. Looking back on the terrifying events of that freezing January afternoon, I am entirely convinced that his brave intervention is the sole reason I am still alive and unharmed today. I was 19 years old, and I had just recently returned home from my exhausting manual labor summer job. I spent my days working as part of the maintenance and landscaping crew at an exclusive, highly manicured country club in the rolling hills of Ohio. The date was sometime in the middle of July 2023. During my long shift operating heavy machinery in the relentless heat, I had been exchanging text messages with my closest childhood friend, Marcus, making solid plans to hang out at his residence that evening. After completing my shift, I climbed into my reliable sedan and initiated the drive over to his property at approximately 6 in the evening. Because it was the peak of the Midwestern summer season, 6 in the evening meant the sun was still positioned high in the sky, providing ample, bright daylight. Marcus's family resided in a massive, sprawling, historically registered farmhouse situated in a highly isolated, deeply rural section of the county. The property was surrounded by miles of dense cornfields and old-growth forests. As I was navigating the winding dirt roads leading toward his property, Marcus called my cellular phone. He informed me that he had been delayed running a vital errand in the nearby town and would likely arrive at the farmhouse a short while after I got there. He instructed me to just let myself inside, mentioning that the side door adjacent to the wraparound porch was entirely unlocked, and assured me he would return shortly. This casual arrangement was completely normal for us, so I did not think twice about it. I pulled my vehicle up the long gravel driveway, parked in the shade of a massive weeping willow tree, and approached the house. I entered through the designated side door and walked straight into the spacious, rustic kitchen. I opened the large stainless steel refrigerator, retrieved a cold, canned beverage, and casually made my way toward the second floor. The upper level of the farmhouse featured a massive, open-concept loft area furnished with several comfortable couches and a large, flat-screen television. I settled onto the largest couch and spent a considerable amount of time aimlessly flipping through various television channels. After perhaps 30 or 40 minutes of solitary relaxation, I felt the natural urge to use the restroom. I stood up and walked slowly down the long, carpeted hallway to the main guest bathroom, which was situated directly at the top of the main wooden staircase leading up from the first floor. I entered the bathroom, closed the door securely, and sat down. To pass the time, I picked up a vintage, heavily worn automotive magazine from a woven wicker basket sitting on the floor. After a few quiet minutes of reading, a distinct noise broke the silence of the house. I clearly heard the heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps walking across the wooden floorboards on the level directly beneath me, operating under the entirely logical assumption that Marcus had finally returned from his errands. I raised my voice and shouted a greeting down the stairs. I then followed it up by making a highly inappropriate, sarcastic joke regarding my current vulnerable predicament in the bathroom. I waited with a smirk, fully expecting him to shout an equally crude and humorous insult back up the stairs. I was met with absolutely nothing but total, heavy silence. I raised my voice significantly louder this time, explicitly stating that I was occupying the upstairs restroom. Still, there was no vocal response. At this precise juncture, my mind naturally attempted to rationalize the situation. I'd figured he was simply ignoring me, or perhaps he was wearing noise-canceling headphones while unpacking groceries. It really did not seem like a significant issue at all. Then, the heavy rhythmic sounds began again. The footsteps started to ascend the main wooden staircase. With every single step, the ancient wood groaned loudly under immense pressure. The most alarming detail was the sheer weight of the steps. They sounded incredibly heavy, entirely too forceful and lumbering to belong to Marcus, who was a relatively slender, athletic individual. A sudden, intense, and freezing chill traveled rapidly down the entire length of my spine. That was the exact moment the profound realization struck me. Something in the atmosphere of the house was completely, utterly, and terrifyingly wrong. The air felt unnaturally thick, and my breathing grew shallow. I listened in absolute, paralyzed horror as the heavy footsteps reached the final stair. The unseen individual was now standing on the second-floor landing, positioned directly outside the thin, hollow-core wooden door of the bathroom. Only inches separated me from whoever was standing in the hallway. Attempting to project a false sense of bravado to mask my rising panic, I spoke aloud. I demanded that he stop playing stupid pranks and identify himself. My voice wavered noticeably, betraying my intense fear. There was absolutely no verbal response, no laughter, no movement, just a suffocating, oppressive silence lingering right outside the door. I honestly had no conceivable idea how to handle the terrifying situation. I remained seated, desperately clinging to the fading hope that it was just Marcus executing an incredibly elaborate, deeply cruel practical joke. I waited in complete, agonizing silence for another 2 full minutes. The tension in the small room was so intense, it was almost a physical weight pressing against my chest. Finally, the silence was broken. The heavy footsteps slowly turned and began to walk deliberately down the long hallway, moving progressively further away from the bathroom door. I did not waste a single precious second. I immediately finished my business, threw the magazine aside, and practically tore the bathroom door open. I sprinted frantically down the wooden stairs, taking them 3 at a time, risking a severe fall. I burst through the front door, cleared the porch in a single bound, and ran directly out into the center of the expansive front yard. I stopped and frantically scanned the property. Aside from my own sedan parked beneath the willow tree, the massive gravel driveway was entirely empty. There was no other vehicle in sight. It was mathematically impossible for it to have been Marcus playing a joke. I was, theoretically, the only living person on the entire property. I quickly pulled my cellular phone from my pocket and dialed Marcus's number, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped the device. The call went straight to his digital voicemail. He was not answering. The sun was finally beginning to set, casting long, eerie, dark shadows across the fields. But there was still a significant amount of ambient light remaining. Being outside in the open air helped calm my racing heart down slightly, but my mind was spinning wildly. I simply could not process or logically explain the terrifying sequence of events that had just transpired. Before I could formulate any sort of coherent plan regarding my next move, a familiar vehicle crested the hill. Marcus's truck pulled smoothly into the long driveway and parked next to my car. He stepped out, holding a small plastic shopping bag, and immediately noticed my pale, panicked expression. He asked me what was wrong, and I breathlessly recounted every single terrifying detail of the last 15 minutes. We realized together that since it had only been a few short minutes since I had fled the house in terror, whoever or whatever had walked up those stairs must logically still be trapped somewhere inside the farmhouse. Because we were both young, impulsive, and perhaps remarkably foolish, we refused to call the authorities. Instead, we marched over to the detached wooden storage shed. I grabbed a heavy, solid aluminum baseball bat, and Marcus armed himself with a heavy steel golf putter. We made the mutual, highly dangerous decision to re-enter the house and aggressively search the entire property ourselves. We entered the house cautiously and headed up the main staircase at an agonizingly slow pace, fully expecting a violent individual to ambush us from behind every dark corner. But the massive house was completely, utterly dead quiet. We did not hear a single floorboard groan, a door hinge complain, or any other ambient noise. We slowly and methodically walked down the exact same upstairs hallway, moving in the specific direction I had clearly heard the heavy footsteps retreating. The long hallway terminated in a massive, enclosed storage room that possessed absolutely no other doors or exterior windows. We knew with absolute certainty that this was the final, inescapable point where the search would have to conclude. We burst into the room, weapons raised and ready to strike. The room was completely empty. There was no one hiding in the corners. There were no dirty boot marks or footprints left on the pristine carpet. None of the heavy antique wooden furniture had been shifted or moved. Absolutely nothing was out of its proper place. We spent the next 30 minutes looking absolutely everywhere. We searched under the heavy beds, behind the massive storage cabinets, and inside every single closet. We thoroughly investigated the entire remainder of the farmhouse, checking every room on the lower level and even inspecting the dark, damp basement. After coming up entirely empty-handed, Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, lowered his golf club, and flatly told me that I was losing my mind. He insisted that the isolation and the heat must have caused me to imagine the entire terrifying scenario. But to this very day, nearly a year later, I know with absolute, unwavering certainty exactly what I experienced. There was undeniably a physical presence inside that rural farmhouse with me. There was someone, or perhaps something, standing menacingly right outside that bathroom door, fully aware of my presence inside. Whatever entity it was, and whoever it might have been, I am incredibly, profoundly thankful that they ultimately made the silent decision to walk away and leave me completely alone. I am an incredibly passionate fanatic of the horror entertainment genre. I am a 20-year-old woman, and over the course of the past 3 years, I have been obsessively collecting a wide variety of horror memorabilia. My extensive collection ranges from small, detailed action figures to expensive cinema-quality replica masks, and even extends to incredibly rare, full-size life figures of famous cinematic villains. I will clarify right from the beginning that I do not consider this specific story to be inherently terrifying in the traditional sense. However, to my mind, the bizarre events of that evening fundamentally saved my life. I will attempt to relate the details as clearly and comprehensively as possible. I have always maintained a deep, specific fascination with the iconic character of the silent, masked killer from the Halloween film franchise. Last October, during the height of the autumn season, I made a significant financial investment and purchased an incredibly detailed, life-size replica figure of this specific character. To add to the collection, I also acquired a highly realistic, terrifyingly accurate doll based on a famous cinematic killer toy. These were not cheap, mass-produced decorations found at a local party store. These were incredibly expensive, custom-made replicas designed to look entirely indistinguishable from the actual props used on the movie sets. Many of my friends and family members frequently refer to my hobby as bizarre or borderline concerning, but I simply adore the artistry and the adrenaline rush associated with the horror genre. Due to space constraints in my current home located in the suburbs of Austin, Texas, I currently keep the vast majority of my extensive collection carefully stored away in protective bins in the attic. The singular exception to this rule is the massive, life-size figure. This imposing figure stands approximately 6 feet and 2 inches tall. The craftsmanship is truly extraordinary. He features a genuine studio-quality latex mask, authentic, heavy-duty mechanic coveralls that have been artificially weathered and stained with fake theatrical blood, and his right hand tightly grips a large, remarkably realistic prop kitchen knife. I keep him stationed permanently in the far corner of my personal bedroom, positioned directly adjacent to my bed. I freely admit that during the first few weeks of owning him, waking up in the middle of the night and seeing a tall, dark, threatening silhouette looming in the shadows of my room gave me severe anxiety. However, as time progressed, I gradually became entirely accustomed to his silent presence. It eventually reached a point where I actually felt a strange, inexplicable sense of comfort and security having him standing guard in the room. I never relocated him to any other part of the residence, primarily because my roommates find him absolutely repulsive and deeply unsettling. Now that the extensive background context is established, I will detail the terrifying incident that occurred in the early spring of 2024. On this particular evening, my roommates were attending a large music festival downtown, leaving me completely home alone for the entire night. I was relaxing comfortably on the large sectional sofa in the downstairs living room, engrossed in a marathon of vintage slasher films. The volume on the television was set fairly high. Suddenly, cutting through the audio of the movie, I distinctly heard a heavy, muffled impact originating from the second floor of the house. I froze instantly, the remote control slipping from my grasp. I genuinely did not know how to process the sudden noise. After a few moments of paralyzing indecision, I slowly pushed myself off the sofa and crept cautiously up the stairs toward my bedroom. As soon as I reached the top landing, I immediately heard another series of violent, heavy impacts, this time originating directly from the heavy wooden door at the rear of the downstairs kitchen. I had absolutely zero comprehension of what was transpiring. I knew with absolute certainty that I was supposed to be the only living soul on the entire property. Panic seized my chest. I quickly retreated into my bedroom, quietly pushed the door mostly shut, and sat down heavily on the floor in the pitch-black darkness. I deliberately chose not to illuminate any of the overhead lights, hoping to remain entirely concealed. I strained my ears, listening intently to the chaotic sounds echoing from the first floor. I soon heard the low, aggressive, and unmistakable sounds of two distinct male voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. That was the horrifying moment the reality of the situation fully materialized in my mind. Multiple intruders had successfully breached the house, and I suddenly remembered with a sickening wave of guilt that I had completely forgotten to engage the deadbolt lock on the back patio door earlier that evening. Furthermore, the television in the living room was still blaring loudly, meaning these men were absolutely aware that the house was currently occupied. Despite the overwhelming terror, I remained seated rigidly on the floor, trapped in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom. Positioned directly across from me, towering in the shadows, was the silent masked figure. The heavy, deliberate sound of large boots began ascending the wooden staircase. Each step echoed loudly, signaling their direct approach toward my location. I pressed my back firmly against the cold drywall, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. The world around me began to spin wildly, and I felt a sudden intense wave of nausea wash over me. I was certain I was going to lose consciousness. I began to sweat profusely, the cold moisture stinging my eyes. The door to my bedroom was suddenly kicked wide open. The ambient light from the hallway spilled into the room, revealing the terrifying silhouette of a tall man wearing a dark, heavy hooded sweatshirt. He stepped aggressively into the room, his eyes scanning the darkness, and immediately locked his gaze onto my trembling form huddled in the corner. He held an object tightly in his right hand. The metallic glint caught the hallway light, revealing a sharp, folding pocket blade. I pressed myself harder against the wall, desperately clawing at the carpet, wanting nothing more than to grab any sort of heavy object to defend myself. The man took a threatening step forward, raising the blade slightly. Then, completely out of nowhere, an absolute miracle occurred. The right arm of the massive life-size figure standing in the corner suddenly jerked upward in a swift mechanical motion. It is absolutely crucial to keep in mind that the room was still largely engulfed in heavy darkness. The intruder had absolutely no idea that the imposing figure was standing silently directly behind him. Furthermore, the movement did not produce any sort of mechanical, robotic humming, or electrical noise. The only audible noise was the highly realistic sound of the thick, heavy fabric of the blood-stained coveralls forcefully rubbing together as the arm raised the prop knife high into the air. The sudden, unexpected sound directly behind him caused the intruder to violently flinch. He spun around rapidly, raising his own weapon defensively. When he found himself suddenly face to face with the towering, masked, blood-soaked figure brandishing a massive blade in the darkness, he completely lost his mind. The man let out a high-pitched, absolutely terrified yell that echoed throughout the entire house. I have genuinely never witnessed a human being move with such frantic, desperate speed in my entire life. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, and bolted out of the bedroom. As he scrambled frantically down the staircase, he began screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that his unseen accomplice abandon the robbery and flee the premises immediately. I could hear a large cargo van idling loudly in the driveway outside. I shakily stood up, walked to my bedroom window, and watched in pure disbelief as the two men threw themselves into the vehicle and sped away down the dark suburban street recklessly. After ensuring they were entirely gone, I noticed a large, jagged crack running down the center of my window pane. It became obvious that these criminals had been throwing heavy stones at the upper windows, likely attempting to gauge if anyone was home or to create a distraction before forcing entry. But in the immediate aftermath, I did not care about the damaged glass at all. I slowly turned around and simply stared in absolute awe at the tall figure standing in the corner. I had absolutely no logical explanation for what had just transpired. I had possessed the figure for months and had never once seen it move. I cautiously approached it, feeling along its back, and finally discovered a small, hidden battery compartment and a concealed motion sensor switch. It turned out the figure was actually an advanced animatronic model the entire time, a detail I had completely missed upon purchasing it secondhand. However, the sheer astronomical improbability of the situation still completely baffles me. I had never installed batteries in the device, nor had I ever activated the switch. Yet, it managed to execute a sudden, aggressive movement at the exact critical millisecond I was about to be violently attacked, effectively terrifying an armed intruder and absolutely saving my life that night. I can actually look back and find a twisted sense of humor in the situation now, primarily due to how genuinely, utterly terrified that grown man was by a mechanized piece of plastic and latex. I eventually had the broken window professionally repaired. I contacted the local police department and filed a comprehensive report regarding the home invasion, providing them with a detailed description of the men and the van. Unfortunately, there was very little physical evidence, and they were never apprehended. I filed the report primarily to establish a record, just in case these individuals attempted to target other vulnerable homes in our neighborhood. Incredibly, absolutely nothing of value was taken from the first floor of the house. They were completely driven away by pure, unadulterated fear. I am fully aware that this masked figure is designed to look incredibly menacing, and anyone encountering it unexpectedly, especially in pitch-black darkness, would be deeply unnerved. I know this entire narrative sounds completely insane, and perhaps even like a poorly written movie script, but this terrifying incident occurred exactly as I have described it. I am so incredibly, profoundly thankful that I decided to keep him stationed in my bedroom. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that a horror collectible would actively intervene and save my life in such a dramatic fashion. I will constantly question the bizarre physics of how he managed to move that night. Was it a delayed mechanical malfunction? Was it an incredibly timed electrical short? Or was it some sort of bizarre, unexplainable cosmic coincidence? I suppose I will never truly uncover the logical answer. But regardless of the reasoning, I owe a massive debt of gratitude to that figure. Only the universe knows what that desperate, armed man would have ultimately done to me if that animatronic arm had remained perfectly still. I have spent the vast majority of my entire life residing in highly remote, deeply rural environments. Whether it involved working on sprawling agricultural farms in the deep valleys of Tennessee, or living surrounded by swampy wilderness in the absolute middle of nowhere in central Florida, I have experienced a wide variety of isolated living conditions. Growing up in these extreme locations meant existing entirely without access to the modern conveniences and technological commonalities that society has grown thoroughly accustomed to enjoying. That statement is entirely accurate. Throughout my childhood, my family did not possess an active internet connection. We did not own a television set. And, as you can likely easily guess, we absolutely did not have cellular communication devices. I am fully aware of how challenging that sounds to modern ears. It was, to many, a truly horrifying lack of connectivity. I often view my siblings and myself as the final remnants of the specific generation that existed just before the massive digital internet age completely took over the world. I am not suggesting that early digital connections did not exist entirely during that era, but the vast majority of working-class families living in deep rural poverty simply did not have the financial means or the infrastructure to access them. But honestly, living off the digital grid was not a terrible existence. Aside from the incredibly long, excruciatingly boring summer afternoons where the punishing humidity felt as though we were slowly cooking alive while laboring in the open fields, we found ways to adapt. During the specific time period in question, which was the late autumn of 2023, my family was renting a massive, incredibly ancient, pre-Civil War era log cabin situated deep within the heavily forested Catskill Mountains of upstate New York. Living in such an ancient, isolated structure frequently produced a multitude of highly unusual, often deeply unsettling experiences. The story I'm about to share is merely one of many terrifying encounters I experienced while living on that specific mountain. The narrative begins on what appeared to be an entirely typical, uneventful Friday evening. My two older brothers and I were left completely home alone for the night, while our parents drove down the mountain into the nearest town to purchase essential household supplies. Because we lacked any form of digital entertainment or electronic devices to occupy our attention, we frequently resorted to playing elaborate, highly competitive games of physical hide and seek throughout the massive interior and exterior of the property. Generally speaking, we strongly preferred to keep our games contained entirely within the interior walls of the cabin. Once the sun dipped below the mountain ridge, the surrounding forest was plunged into a state of absolute, impenetrable darkness, and the sheer volume of predatory wildlife in the area made wandering outside highly dangerous. To provide a clear understanding of the environment, our ancient log cabin was precariously situated at the very peak of a remarkably steep, rocky incline. The property was accessed via a miles-long, winding, treacherous dirt driveway that was prone to severe washouts during heavy rainstorms. The architectural layout of the cabin itself consisted of 3 distinct levels. There was a damp, unfinished stone basement set into the earth. The expansive main floor housed the communal living spaces, the kitchen, and my brother's quarters. Finally, there was a cramped, angled upper loft area that served as my personal bedroom. Additionally, the rear of the cabin featured a large, decaying wooden deck that was elevated significantly off the sloping ground, suspended nearly 15 feet in the air by massive timber posts. Returning to the events of that specific Friday evening, the exterior world was already completely enveloped in pitch-black darkness. Venturing further than the immediate illuminated radius of the back porch was an activity none of us enjoyed or willingly participated in. Our ongoing game of hide and seek was initially entertaining, but due to the limited amount of functional hiding spaces within the cabin, the activity was rapidly becoming highly predictable and deeply monotonous. Driven by a sudden surge of competitive adrenaline and a foolish desire to outsmart my older siblings, I formulated what I considered to be a brilliant, unbeatable strategy. I decided to quietly exit the cabin through my second-floor bedroom window and physically climb out onto the steep incline of the exterior roof. I believed this completely unexpected location would make the game infinitely more exciting and guarantee my victory. In hindsight, this incredibly reckless decision would quickly transform into one of the most profound and terrifying regrets of my entire life. Initially, the situation felt entirely peaceful and perfectly normal. The season was rapidly transitioning into late autumn, and the mountain climate was growing exceptionally cold. There was a steady, biting breeze blowing through the valley, and the surrounding air felt incredibly crisp, clean, and strangely calming. However, after remaining seated completely motionless on the freezing roof shingles for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, a profound, undeniable sensation of wrongness washed over me. The atmosphere completely shifted. I had been sitting quietly, deeply relaxed, and practically hypnotized by the overwhelming, deafening chorus of millions of insects echoing from the dense woods below. Suddenly, I realized with a sharp jolt of panic that every single noise in the entire forest had abruptly and entirely ceased. The sudden, absolute silence was suffocating. It felt heavy and deeply unnatural. At that specific age, I possessed a dangerous level of naive ignorance. I did not immediately comprehend that in deep wilderness environments, a sudden total cessation of ambient wildlife noise usually signifies the immediate, close proximity of a massive apex predator. I remained frozen in place, sitting as perfectly still as humanly possible. I strained my ears to the absolute limit, desperately trying to detect any recognizable sound in the darkness. I could hear absolutely nothing. Even the steady breeze rustling through the dead leaves seemed to have vanished entirely. Then, as rapidly and violently as the suffocating silence had descended, an explosive eruption of noise suddenly shattered the quiet. The deafening sound originated directly from the far opposite end of the massive roof structure. To provide essential context, the cabin was equipped with a highly resonant corrugated metal roofing system. This specific material made it incredibly easy to detect and amplify the sound of absolutely anything making physical contact with the surface, whether it was falling pine cones, heavy rain, or animal claws. The violent noise I heard sounded exactly as if an incredibly massive, heavy object had fallen directly out of the night sky and landed with tremendous force onto the metal panels on the far side of the structure. The impact actually caused the heavy wooden beams supporting the roof to shudder beneath me. I immediately twisted my body and stared intensely into the darkness toward the source of the impact, but my eyes could detect absolutely nothing. The roof appeared entirely empty. This terrifying lack of visual confirmation left me deeply, profoundly unnerved. My immediate, overwhelming instinct was to abandon the game entirely, scramble backward through my open window, and completely remove myself from the highly exposed, vulnerable situation. Before allowing my rising panic to fully consume my rationality, I desperately attempted to convince myself that the entire terrifying ordeal was merely an elaborate, cruel psychological trick being orchestrated by my older brothers. I assumed they had finally given up searching the interior of the house, deduced my location, and were intentionally trying to frighten me into revealing myself. Acting on this fragile assumption, I slid backward toward my open bedroom window, leaned inside, and loudly called out my brothers' names. I demanded that they stop messing around. Within seconds, both of my brothers came rushing up the narrow wooden staircase, bursting into my room. They were breathing heavily and immediately began loudly complaining and lecturing me, reminding me strictly that climbing onto the steep metal roof was completely prohibited by our parents due to the extreme fall hazard. As my eldest brother approached the window frame to pull me inside, I aggressively confronted him. I demanded to know if he or our middle brother had been sneaking around outside, throwing heavy rocks onto the metal roof or otherwise attempting to terrify me in the dark. He looked at me with genuine confusion and immediately, forcefully denied the accusation. He stated that they had been searching the basement the entire time. Seeing the genuine, lingering fear clearly written across my pale face, his protective instincts activated. He stated that he wanted to climb out onto the roof with me to physically investigate the strange noise and ensure the area was secure. I reluctantly agreed. He carefully climbed through the window, and together, we slowly and meticulously navigated our way toward the absolute center peak of the sloping metal roof. We stopped, crouched low to maintain our balance, and remained completely silent, listening intently to the surrounding environment. The absolute suffocating silence had completely returned. The atmosphere around us was entirely dead, exactly as it had been moments before the massive impact. At this point, my nerves were completely frayed. I was entirely on edge, my muscles tense and tightly coiled, fully prepared to physically fight off a wild animal or any other threat that might emerge from the absolute darkness. Without warning, the terrifying sounds began again. We both clearly heard a highly distinct, incredibly forceful pounding noise originating from the extreme far edge of the metal roof, situated in the complete opposite direction from where we were currently positioned. We remained frozen, listening in absolute terror. After what I can distinctly remember as 3 highly specific rhythmic sets of exactly 6 deafening heavy impacts against the metal, the unseen entity suddenly charged directly at our position. At least, the audio evidence suggested a rapid, violent charge. The terrifying sounds rushing toward us resembled the frantic, heavy galloping of large, hardened animal hooves striking the corrugated metal surface with immense, punishing force. The impacts were incredibly loud, echoing violently into the silent mountain air. But the most horrifying, entirely incomprehensible issue was that we could not visually see a single thing. We had an unobstructed, clear line of sight across the entire expanse of the roof. The surface was completely, undeniably clear. Aside from my brother and myself, there was absolutely no physical creature, human or animal, present on the structure. Yet, against all logic and physical reality, we were both clearly hearing these massive, heavy footsteps rapidly closing the distance between us. The invisible, thundering footsteps rapidly approached our immediate location and suddenly began running in tight, frantic, continuous circles directly around our crouched bodies. Operating purely on terrified instinct, I blindly extended my arms outward into the freezing night air, desperately trying to physically feel or intercept whatever invisible mass was generating the violent noise. My hands met nothing but empty, freezing air. The absolute most terrifying and logic-defying aspect of the entire ordeal was the physical sensation. I could distinctly, undeniably feel the heavy localized vibrations of the massive footsteps traveling forcefully through the metal panels and directly into the soles of my shoes as the entity circled us. But I could not see a physical form, nor could I feel any displaced air or physical mass passing by my outstretched hands. These heavy, invisible impacts continued to circle us relentlessly for what felt like an absolute eternity. The psychological torture of the experience was overwhelming. In reality, the frantic circling likely lasted no more than 60 to 90 seconds at the absolute most. Then, exactly as abruptly as the violent charging had begun, the chaotic circling completely stopped. We crouched in terror as we clearly heard the heavy, distinct footsteps deliberately walk away from our position, travel slowly toward the extreme edge of the sloping roof, and then simply vanish entirely into thin air, leaving no sound of an impact on the ground 15 feet below. My brother and I did not exchange a single word. We simultaneously scrambled frantically backward, practically diving headfirst through my bedroom window. We slammed the glass shut, engaged the heavy metal locks, and sprinted downstairs. We systematically locked every single exterior door and window in the entire cabin, closed all the heavy wooden shutters, and huddled tightly together in the center of the illuminated living room, absolutely, completely, and permanently terrified of whatever unseen horror stalked the mountain that night. I am currently a 32-year-old man, and I live entirely alone with my incredibly large, exceptionally lazy Maine Coon cat named Barnaby. I purchased my current residential property in the late autumn of 2024, meaning I am still a relatively fresh face within this particular neighborhood. I work remotely as a senior data analyst for a large technology firm, which means I spend the vast majority of my time inside the confines of my own property. I deliberately chose to move to the sprawling, evergreen suburbs of Seattle, Washington, specifically seeking a quiet, isolated environment away from the chaotic energy of the inner city. My home is a beautiful, deeply traditional craftsman-style house. It features a wide, sweeping front porch, thick wooden columns, and heavily insulated windows designed to keep out the perpetual, freezing Pacific Northwest drizzle. The property is surrounded by massive ancient pine trees that constantly shed thick layers of brown needles onto my sloping roof. For the first few months of living here, I experienced a profound sense of peace. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets were lined with thick green moss, and the residents largely kept to themselves. The house situated directly to the left of my property belongs to an elderly, deeply eccentric woman named Mrs. Higgins. She is a retired middle school teacher who spends her days meticulously tending to her massive, highly elaborate rose garden, regardless of how heavily the rain is falling. We developed a very friendly, cordial relationship almost immediately after the moving trucks departed. We frequently chat over the low wooden fence that separates our front lawns. She is essentially the unofficial historian of the entire street, possessing an incredibly deep, comprehensive knowledge of every single family, every minor scandal, and every piece of trivial neighborhood gossip stretching back 3 decades. One exceptionally gloomy, heavily overcast Tuesday afternoon, I was standing by my metal mailbox, sorting through a stack of damp envelopes. Mrs. Higgins wandered over, wearing her bright yellow floral raincoat and thick rubber gardening gloves. We engaged in our usual casual conversation regarding the terrible weather and the constantly increasing property taxes. Eventually, the topic of conversation naturally drifted toward the other residents living on our quiet street. When I casually brought up the individual who lived in the house directly to the right of my property, her entire demeanor shifted drastically. Let us refer to this particular neighbor as Arthur. Mrs. Higgins suddenly became incredibly tense. Her constant polite smile vanished entirely, and she continuously cast nervous, darting glances over her shoulder toward his property. She leaned in incredibly close to me, her voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. She asked me if I was aware that Arthur had been heavily involved in the brutal, highly publicized murder of a prominent local business owner many years ago. I was completely taken aback by this horrific statement. I was entirely confused and deeply unsettled. I told her that I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about and gently pressed her to provide more details about the incident. I am still not entirely certain if she suddenly deeply regretted sharing this incredibly dark information with a relatively new neighbor, or if she simply became too overwhelmed by fear to continue speaking about the man. Regardless of her internal reasoning, she immediately changed the subject, mumbled an excuse about needing to check on her rosebush, and quickly scurried back inside her house. I did not dare pressure her to elaborate further, respecting her obvious boundaries. After she retreated indoors, I remained standing on the wet sidewalk, staring intensely at Arthur's property. I began to mentally compile the extremely limited amount of information I actually knew about the man. He was an incredibly tall, heavily built man with a thick, unkempt graying beard and deeply sunken, tired eyes. He seemed to exist in a state of absolute, complete isolation. When I first purchased the house and moved my belongings inside, I was honestly slightly concerned for his physical well-being because I absolutely never saw a single electrical light illuminated inside his residence. Every single heavy opaque blackout blind covering his windows was drawn completely shut, day and night, without fail. He drove a heavily rusted dark blue utility van that rarely ever left the concrete slab of his driveway. Furthermore, his property was the absolute only one on our entire street entirely surrounded by a massive, 8-foot-tall, solid wooden privacy fence. The fence completely obscured his backyard from view, and the wooden planks were heavily weathered and covered in thick, creeping ivy. Looking back on these specific architectural details now, they serve as massive, undeniable red flags indicating a deeply disturbed, highly secretive individual. Later that evening, the Seattle rain began to fall in heavy, continuous sheets against my office window. Barnaby the cat was curled up asleep on a warm blanket near the heating vent. I sat down at my heavy oak desk, illuminated only by the stark blue glow of my computer monitor, and made the fateful decision to conduct some digital research. I needed to figure out exactly what Mrs. Higgins had been referencing. Given the incredibly specific, horrific nature of the crime she mentioned, it did not take me very long to uncover the truth. I simply searched his full legal name, which I had previously found on a public property tax registry, alongside the name of our county. The search engine immediately populated with dozens of archived newspaper articles, digital police blotters, and heavily detailed public court transcripts. The bold black headline of the very first article I opened read clearly on the screen. It detailed one of the most uniquely gruesome, deeply disturbing homicides in the history of the entire region. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in absolute frozen horror, reading article after article, absorbing the sickening, violent details of the murder. According to the official court documents, when Arthur was a young adult residing in a heavily populated urban district a few towns over, he and his older cousin formulated a plan to aggressively rob a local, highly successful tailor shop. They intentionally targeted the business late at night, assuming the property would be completely vacant. However, the elderly owner of the shop was working late, completing a massive order of custom garments in the back room. The owner unfortunately caught the two men in the act of emptying the cash register. Instead of simply fleeing the scene and avoiding a major confrontation, Arthur's older cousin aggressively attacked the elderly man, striking him forcefully across the temple with a heavy steel crowbar. The owner immediately lost consciousness and collapsed onto the hardwood floor. According to the heavily documented, highly scrutinized testimony provided by the cousin during the subsequent trial, the situation escalated into an absolute nightmare. While the cousin continued frantically searching the back office for a hidden safe, he returned to the main storefront to find Arthur committing an incredibly brutal, horrific assault on the unconscious owner. After the assault concluded, Arthur located a heavy, solid iron fireplace poker near the decorative display in the shop. He used the iron tool to mercilessly beat the elderly man. Once the victim was deceased, the two men located several gallons of industrial cleaning bleach in the supply closet. They completely saturated the owner's body and the surrounding floors with the harsh chemical, attempting to completely destroy any highly sensitive physical evidence. The two men then stole the victim's personal vehicle from the rear alleyway and fled the city. They were eventually apprehended by state police several days later after they lost control of the stolen vehicle on a stretch of slick, heavily iced highway and crashed into a concrete barrier. The absolute most tragic, heartbreaking detail of the entire ordeal was that the deceased owner's daughter was the one who discovered the horrific scene the following morning when she arrived to open the shop for business. During the incredibly lengthy, highly publicized legal proceedings, Arthur's expensive defense attorneys desperately attempted to utilize an insanity plea. They heavily relied on extensive testimony from his immediate family members, who provided a vast amount of documentation regarding his deeply erratic, highly violent behavioral patterns during his childhood. They even presented formal police records showing that Arthur had once cornered his own mother in their kitchen, threatening her with a large carving knife when he was only 14 years old. Although the formal insanity plea was ultimately entirely unsuccessful in front of the judge, Arthur still managed to receive a shockingly minimal, incredibly pitiful prison sentence. He was legally a minor at the exact time the horrific crime was committed, and his attorneys successfully argued a highly complex, deeply frustrating legal loophole regarding his cognitive development. From my perspective, based on the horrific evidence presented, Arthur played the absolute most disturbing, violent, and purely evil role in the entire ordeal. Yet, he was released back into society after serving only a fraction of the time he truly deserved. His older cousin, who initiated the violent encounter, remained incarcerated significantly longer, but was eventually released on parole in the spring of 2018. The sheer fact that neither of these men received permanent life sentences for completely destroying an innocent family is absolutely ridiculous. It serves as a terrifying, undeniable demonstration of exactly how deeply flawed and completely broken our criminal justice system truly is. After thoroughly discovering all of this horrifying information, I sat in my dark office, completely paralyzed by fear. The thin, plastered wall separating my property from his suddenly felt incredibly fragile, entirely insufficient to protect me from the monster living next door. Every time the wind caused my house to settle, my heart raced. I obsessively checked the locks on my doors and windows multiple times a night. Since that terrifying night of digital research, I have only had one singular direct physical interaction with Arthur. It occurred roughly 3 weeks ago. I was walking down my driveway in the late evening, wheeling my heavy plastic recycling bin toward the curb for the morning collection. The sky was dark, and the streetlights were flickering slightly. As I reached the edge of the street, Arthur suddenly emerged from the heavy shadows of his driveway, carrying a massive, incredibly heavy black trash bag. We locked eyes. His expression was completely blank, entirely devoid of any recognizable human emotion. His eyes were cold, hollow, and deeply unsettling. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline completely flood my entire nervous system. I stood entirely rigid, gripping the handle of my recycling bin so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. He slowly lowered the heavy black bag to the concrete sidewalk. He looked at me for several agonizing seconds. Then, in a low, incredibly raspy voice, he simply stated that the weather was getting colder. I did not respond. I simply nodded my head once, turned around, and walked back up my driveway as quickly as humanly possible without breaking into a full sprint. I locked my front door, engaged a heavy deadbolt, and collapsed against the wood, breathing heavily. I have spent time conversing with individuals who have experienced terrible things, and I generally consider myself to be a highly rational, logical person. I am not necessarily intimidated easily by regular people. I even logically believe in the concept of rehabilitation and the theoretical possibility for former criminals to eventually reintegrate into normal society after undergoing intensive, heavily monitored psychological therapy. But there is a profound, terrifying difference between holding a philosophical belief in rehabilitation and actually living your daily life directly next door to a convicted, brutal killer. The constant looming presence of a man capable of such extreme violence, sleeping merely 30 feet away from my own bed, completely alters my reality. It completely destroys any sense of comfort or security I once felt in this house. The knowledge of what he has done and what he is physically capable of doing simply hits different. It is a suffocating, ever-present nightmare that I cannot escape.